My guest today is Professor Paola Sapienza, who's Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where she co-directs the Initiative on Immigration. Previously, she was Professor of Finance at Northwestern University, Kellogg School of Management. Welcome, Paola.
Thank you, Jill. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I have a couple of your papers. One is, I think, a working paper in process. So the first one is long-term orientation, LTO, you say, and educational performance. So in the abstract, you say here, we study the role of long-term orientation on the educational attainment of immigrant students, controlling for the quality of schools and socioeconomic characteristics. Students from long-term oriented cultures perform better in third grade reading and math, have larger test score gains over time, fewer absences and disciplinary incidents, and are less likely to repeat grades, more likely to enroll in advanced high school courses, and more likely to graduate from high school in 4 years. Um, so there are a lot of interesting things here. So I don't think I have ever seen a study like this going back into second, third, fourth grade kids, because most of the studies are about graduate students, and that's where we find all this. Well, I don't know what the right term is. I mean, there are a lot of international students in graduate schools, as you know. So this type of data we have been collecting for a long time. But you went back to primary school and you found some interesting things there. So talk a little bit about what you found.
Yes, so the motivation was trying to understand. So often we hear, let me just give you a motivation for why doing this paper. So there has been some conflicting data on how immigrants perform in the country. And the reason why it's conflicting is very hard to control for initial conditions.
Mm.
Because, of course, if you come from an affluent family, independently whether you're immigrants or you're not, you're going to overperform compared to the people that are coming from less affluent background. And so in order to make these comparisons, you really have to be very precise about the starting condition. So the children are a very interesting opportunity to study. And the reason mostly is that the data set that we examine here is a unique data set on K to 12 children, and we observe the kids over time. So we actually can not only see how they perform at one point in time, but we can see their growth curve.
Mm.
And one interesting fact about education, maybe a little bit of a sad one, when among education scholars, when one of the key effort has been to try to identify what are the drivers of success, academic success. And one interesting fact is when you put people on a longitudinal panel. In other words, when you measure the growth of the kids in standardized test score, for example, from third to 12th grade or from third to 10th grade, which is what typically is done. Yeah. Unfortunately, one important fact is that the third grade performance is almost a sufficient statistics for knowing how well you're going to do in the future. In other words, your initial conditions are pretty stable. And unfortunately, many scholars have attributed this to the background of the family. But that's not the case for immigrants. Immigrants, they start at a certain point and they keep on growing, and they grow differentially. And so one of the questions that we had early on is trying to understand what are the characteristics, what are the things that make immigrants success heterogeneous among immigrants. So this paper really focuses on differences across immigrants. There is one graph that you may have noticed at one point in the paper where all the immigrants are compared to the Americans. But the majority of the analysis is done immigrants against immigrants. And the idea is to look at the background. We have this amazing data in which we can actually, we know a lot of individual characteristics. We know the schools, so we can control for the institution where the students go, which, of course, if the institution vary in quality, you could expect that they would contribute differently to the success. So controlling so in other words, comparing kids that go to the same institution, they come from very similar background, we can see that the score, both in math and reading, are very different, and the growth is very different. So we were trying to get to the point of what is it that drives this result. And the obvious, they're economists, all the authors in this paper are economists, but a very influential paper was the famous marshmallow story that psychologists have studied. So this idea that, if you have the ability to delay gratification, in other words, sacrifice the present for the future, or, postpone fun, do the homework first. You can think about this in many different ways. Maybe that will really give student a leg up, and some of the studies on these psychological traits, these are at the individual level, of course, suggested that indeed there is a greater academic achievement for those that have they have more delayed gratification. Now, in economics, there is a literature that argues that some countries, mostly because of their initial conditions, they were meant to teach and instill certain values to their to the population that really is very similar to the concept of patience of, financial economists would call it discount rates and so on. So this idea that, the future is more important than the present, is relatively more important for some groups than others. So we wanted to look at whether this was an explanation for the heterogeneity among the students, and that's basically what we find.
So let me understand this. Let me understand this, Paola. So sorry to interrupt. In aggregate populations, we have always known that initial conditions are quite important. If you have good initial conditions, then you're going places. I don't think I can think of, and we talk about the economic success different from educational success later, but I can think of any multi-billion-dollar company created by somebody who didn't have really good initial conditions. And so in aggregate population, we notice that. But I think if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that immigrants coming or going from country X to country Y, if you measure their conditions at start, you will find them growing, unlike somebody who is already in the country. Is that the way to?
So one way of thinking about this is exactly what you say, is that, the conditions, I can actually look at the 10th grade score as a function of the initial condition, which is the 3rd grade score. So imagine that the 3rd grade score is exactly your initial condition. The question is how much you do better than your initial condition. And you're absolutely right, by the way. This is important to keep in mind. Immigrants are highly selected. In fact, I think it's important, especially today's conversation, is very important to keep in mind that a very tiny fraction of the world population emigrate to a different place. It's less than 5%. Most people stay where they were born. And the people that actually pack the bag and move are actually and uproot themselves and go through the the difficulty of doing these are sort of exceptional in that way. And so it's important to keep in mind that these are selected people as they come. And so when there is this debate about the immigrants do better than the natives, but the immigrants are selected from a very large population, especially if they come from countries like India, for example. Like, just it's not that all the Indians are like the Indians who live in the United States. So certainly that is true. So what we try to do here is condition on the fact that they've all been selected. Is there a group that does better depending on the long-term orientation of the country of origin, and controlling for the initial condition, which also means not just how they did in third grade, but what was the education of the parents, what was their income level, and so forth. And of course, also what type of institution they go. And we do find that, if you come from a culture where delayed gratification was a value, teaching kids to be patient and have a future-oriented mindset, you actually, as a student, you tend to, perform better over time, controlling for your initial condition. Then students that come, these are still immigrants. So we're comparing immigrants with immigrants, that immigrants that actually don't come from those kind of culture. So this is a comparison of immigrants against immigrants. And, what we're finding is that some of these cultural characteristics, which are not predetermined, but they are somehow, the economists have studied that sometimes it depends on, initial agricultural condition, the ability to store, for example, food in a certain way. There are some interesting, there is a very interesting paper that looks at really the agricultural possibilities early in the early development of these nations, and sees that those countries that were able to store for a longer time, they actually are the one that show this more of this culture. And so that this culture eventually will gives the subset of immigrants that come from those countries a comparative advantage. I think about this like a little bit. We think about firms having a comparative advantage. So some immigrants have a comparative advantage. Of course, have a comparative advantage where have a comparative advantage in this particular case. We're looking at K-12 Florida public schools, but they have a comparative advantage in a system that has an education where you have to listen to the teacher, do your homework, and so on. Like maybe this is not a comparative advantage elsewhere, but it's that kind of a comparative advantage. And so what we see is that they have better scores, but they also have fewer absence, fewer disciplinary problems. They're much less likely to repeat a grade, and they have a much higher chance of graduating from high school in 4 years. And they're also much more likely to take advanced, the famous AP level classes while in high school, and also to choose scientific subject for those classes. So it seems that these cultural initial characteristics, they sort of affect the way these kids tend to behave. The question is, what is the mechanism through which happen? And so we can talk about that.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about it. So could you define what you mean by long-term orientation of a culture or a country?
Yeah, so in practice is really the willingness to, it's been defined by a social psychologist called Gerd Hofstede, that originally made this very famous study on the IBM, and on the IBM culture across countries, and what he classified the culture in these different places in the different location of IBM as having different dimension. And so the long-term orientation that he defines is actually coming from the way this population respond to certain question regarding thrift. So whether it's important to teach your children to be thrifty, whether it's important to be a long-term planner. So this idea of what are the values that are really taught to the kids. So this is survey-based, and pretty much the way you want to think about this is characteristics that have to deal with time horizon, so future-oriented culture. The future is very important to me. I really would like to go and play with my peers, but I'll do the homework before, because I know that there is a future waiting for me. It's also related to work ethics. So
it's a delayed gratification, as you call it in the paper.
Right, exactly. But it's also related to savings. For example, we have evidence that controlling for income, some nations save more than others, and it's correlated with higher saving rates in this country of origin. So it is correlated with actual behavior, controlling for, of course, the typical dimension that affects savings rates.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, Paula. I mean, I don't know much about this, but there's also a downside to it. I see two downsides. One is a human being has a fixed horizon. We don't know precisely, but it's something less than 100 years, typically. And so if you keep your horizons very, very long, you might consume very little, and you die very rich, possibly. And that is not a good utilitarian situation. My dad is a professor of engineering, and this is sort of the other side, which is it's also a risk management question, in my view, this long-term orientation, right? So he won't cross the road unless he can bring the probability down to very close to zero. And so tactical risk is not something that he would take. And he wouldn't take any strategic risk either, for that matter. So he wouldn't take risk in any form, because his planning horizon is nearly infinite. And I don't know if that's an optimum way to think about things. What do you think?
Actually, we have a paper, with my co-author, Paola Giuliano, we have a paper that sort of tackle on this issue. And you're going to appreciate the title of the paper is The Cost of Being Too Patient. So it's very much tackling on these. And so what we do, we study what is the consequence on patients on one other outcome, which is not the object of the paper we were discussing before, which is happiness. And so we look at we use a survey-based data, several survey-based data, and we look at the relationship between being patient and happiness. And actually we find that it's hump-shaped. So it exists almost an optimal amount of patience that maximizes happiness. But if you go beyond the optimal level, then you actually have a negative impact on the well-being. And, while we were writing this paper on children in school, there was a very intriguing paper written by a number of psychologists, that looked at Los Angeles public school kids. And they did this with experiment because they were psychologists, and they were interested in the level of stress that culture of this type bring. And one of the things that they brought up was that in the Southeast Asian, which are really the overperforming and also the one with very high long-term orientation, they were very much stressed. There was a lot of stress in that. And so the question, the balance is also very important. And that's a very important thing that you bring up, because I don't want to give a positive or negative balance. Our interests were trying to understand the heterogeneity, but of course, many things come with their own cost, and often there is too much of a good thing it becomes like a bad thing. And so I think you're hitting a very good point here.
The other thing I was thinking about is, so we are generally talking about a sort of academic success, LTO related to academic success. I'm not exactly sure if academic success is highly correlated with economic success anymore. So the engineering school that I went to, which is very highly selective, compared to MIT or Stanford, were very comparable to MIT and Stanford, perhaps a little less admission rate. But it creates generally good workers. It produces workers who go work for somebody. There is really no entrepreneurship. There's really no risk taking coming out of there. Whereas MIT and Stanford has created entrepreneurs who have created or almost changed the world in some ways. And so there is a downside to adhering to principles or adhering to I don't think it's principles, but it's really saying, hey, I'm here to do this, and I'm going to do this well, and I'm going to look forward. I'm not going to do anything bad. I'm not going to drop out ever, and I'm going to get my PhD and be happy with it. But perhaps at some point in the past, that might have been a good strategy. But I'm not sure that's a good strategy anymore. I don't think Kellogg teaches kids that anymore, do they?
So, I mean, this is interesting. It's hard to answer to this, because I would think the experiment you need to do is the following. Because MIT and Stanford, I know MIT particularly well because my husband went there. They teach somehow to be very creative at the same time. So, but I wouldn't argue that MIT is an easy school. So the question that I would like to answer is, if I take and we don't have the perfect data to do this, but if I take equivalent of my exercise, where I get a class of, say, graduate students at MIT that come from very different countries, how would they perform? And, of course, it will have to have, because, MIT will teach the same thing to everyone. Yeah. And then the question is, this is going to be on top of their embedded culture. And so that is going to be interesting to see. Now, I would guess, if I look at the success of many, for example, Indian in the US, I think that who originally came as graduate students, that they, of course, again, it's a lot of selection of who came here, but I think there is a pretty strong case that they have done quite well, and so is with many other people that come from the same background. So, if you look at the basics data on immigrants in the U.S., I'm talking about, high-skill immigrant, there is about 14% of foreign-born people in the U.S. But if you start looking at patents or patent citation, 26% come from immigrants. So that's a measure of ingenuity or innovation. These are first generation immigrants. There is a beautiful paper, from some of my colleagues that, some people at Stanford and Berkeley, and who actually looked at exactly these. They were able to identify the foreign-born. They're not able to identify the nationality, but what they find is that immigrants produce more patents and more highly cited patents. And many of these immigrants are immigrants that came to the United States And as first generation, they mostly did undergraduate in the country of origin, and then they came here and they used the educational system. What we don't know, and so that's one of the things that I would love to see this, what we don't know is, of course, we know that they're selected. Probably the best of the best were admitted. I think really the U.S. is a formidable talent selection because the university admission process of foreign students is very meritocratic, right? So they're probably skimming the very top of the top. And then, they're bringing them here. And so it's like, it's a little bit unfair to compare them to the native students who, they belong to the rest of the population. But it's not that unfair to compare them to the graduate from the same institution. And I actually think that they do perform better. They create more entrepreneurship. There is a paper by Giovanni Peri that shows the outcome of the master students coming to the U.S. From foreign places. So I think I don't know if there is. It's hard to compare people that stay in India because the problem is that they also breathe a culture, and if you want, also an academic culture, which maybe is more compliant rather than creative. And I think I'm convinced that that's an interesting point, but I'm not so sure that you can compare them with the people that went to MIT. You should compare the immigrants that went to MIT with the non-immigrants that went to MIT, and then look at the differences between the two.
Yeah, so I haven't really seen the data, but the Indian case is quite interesting. I mean, we have a lot of Indian CEOs in the US, very large companies, IBM, Google, Microsoft, and so on. But I can think of any Indian graduate student in the US who created a very large company. So they're good CEOs. I mean, we have data on that. They might be good consensus builders. They're good workers. They're very programmatic, systematic thinkers. But entrepreneurship and creativity are different elements. It takes significant risk taking. Actually, I mean, it's all or nothing type position. And I think if you go to a very good academic program, it drains your, especially if you're an immigrant, it drains all your risk-taking capabilities in some ways. I'm making a statement here. You can react to it.
So I'm going to push back a little bit. So, here is a couple of that come to mind, and, I don't. So Vinod Khosla, he was the co-founder of Sun Microsystem. I think the CEO founder of Perplexity, which is one of the AI. I mean, you probably know them, is an Indian origin, I would think. I think there is. I think one of the co-founder of Hotmail, it was Sabir Bhatia. I think, I don't know, we should really look at as a comparison to how many would come. But I think there is a substantial impact. Maybe they're concentrated in certain areas, and then the areas where they, there is a trend, of course, is what type of, is biotech in certain period, or is computer science in others period. And so, but I actually wonder, I mean, I understand that, we have a lot of CEOs, but I think we also have co-founders that are, now not all of them come to my, I think SanDisk, at least one of the co-founder of SanDisk was an Indian, Sanjay Mehrotra, I think. And I think some of the Khosla now has a very important venture capital firm who founded Khosla Venture, but I think he founded Sun Microsystem early on. And so I don't know. I mean, we need to count and do this more systematically in order to do, to get this right.
There's always exceptions. I mean, we don't have enough data to make any conclusions on this, obviously. So I was looking at raw data by institution. So the engineering school I went to in India called IIT, sometimes compared favorably with MIT and Stanford, hasn't really produced any world-changing entrepreneurs, I would argue. They have produced good CEOs, good professors, good academics. That's what we are taught. We are really taught how to do that. That's the technology we are given. And when you're given that technology, it has some downsides because, like I said, my dad wouldn't cross the road unless the probability of getting killed is nearly zero. It is just a matter of analysis. So I'm a bit conflicted about.
But you're still focusing on the people that stayed in India, or because I think what's important is the U.S. is a unique ecosystem. So, I really, and this is one of just to go back to our paper, our difficulties, could never compare, kids from a certain origin in their country of origin with in their other country of origin, because the school system is very different, the upbringing is different, and so on. We wanted to, in economics, there is a big debate between culture and institution. And so we wanted them to be in the same institution, the school.
Yeah.
This was Florida Public Schools.
Yeah.
And then we wanted to see whether, given the opportunity, and of course, these are elementary to K to 12 students, so young, malleable one. I think one could argue, maybe by the time you do undergraduate at IIT, then you have incorporated a culture of not risk-taking. But I think what I find fascinating, and I think fascinating in this current debate in the US, is you look at some of these founders. I think the founder of Perplexity is a good example. And I think he still has an H-1B, or he had early in the Trump administration. So not easy for Indian to move along those dimensions, because we know that there is a big bottleneck, especially for countries that produce a lot of talent, just because they're very large. And why did he? This is the question I would ask if I had a chance to talk to him. Why did he decide to start Perplexity in San Francisco? If you have,
and then for capital.
It's capital, is talent, is the environment. So I think the ecosystem that the U.S. has is unique. And I think Canada, which is the second largest recipient of immigrant, and in the ranking in terms of favorability by immigrants, comes second, but far below the U.S., is not able to do this. I often think that Canada is the waiting room for the U.S., right? It's like, just and mostly is that there isn't the same level of resources, but also of I call it the network effect. There is so much talent, so it's easy to hire, it's easy to get capital, it's easy to take risk. So I think you want to control for the environment. And so the question that you're asking is a very valid one, is like, controlling for the environment. You could ask the question in the following way. It says, like, when is it too late for Indian to immigrate to the United States?
Exactly.
So when is it too late? Because, maybe you're talented, but you have, and, that's a question that, hopefully we can answer in the future if we get better data. But I think
so
that's
there is an
inverted
U curve there too. So there is an optimum immigration window.
I think I agree with that, and let me And I think this is one of the things that is often missed in this high talent immigration debate, which is the really successful people immigrate quite early, not as early as undergraduate degree, but as early as postgraduate, so 23-year-old. And so this idea that they should be paid 2 million or 1.5 million and so on because they must be so talented, we didn't know how talented Elon Musk was when he started. But it's mostly like really, is the potential of these people, and the best time to, unleash that potential is really at this early stage. Like, take these really hungry people that want to have a better life, because the return on investment, if you work very hard in the US, and that's another thing that I think the US is unique compared to other countries. I call it the exorbitant privilege, in the sense that the US has the exorbitant privilege to tap the best talent in the world, and shouldn't. At the moment, at this particular moment in life, in the stage of geopolitical tension, shouldn't squander these, and should rather double down in the eagerness, exploiting the eagerness that many people really have about making a difference in this country. But you make a difference, you're right, within this ecosystem.
So I want to touch on one more point. I want to go into another paper. So you talk about the transmission of the culture into second generation and perhaps even further generations from there. And it's an interesting phenomenon for me. I came here as an immigrant. I have a US-born daughter. And so I can sort of look at that. So in the data, you're saying these cultural attributes are transmitted, that second generation American-born kids of an immigrant actually picks up these cultural parameters and goes on with it.
Yeah. So, and I want to be careful here, because the second generation in our sample of kids are second generation that, so the difference between a first generation and a second generation in our sample is between a third grader who arrived as a 3-year-old and, from a foreign, coming from a foreign family, and a third grader, because this is the first time, the kids are tested, who actually was born in the US from an immigrant family. Okay, so don't think about one as being the son of the other. It's like these kids are very similar. They may speak a foreign language at home and so on. And so, but the parents, but they're US born. And so as such, they're citizens, and maybe they have fewer language barriers than the other group and so on. And so the idea, and actually I shared the same history as you. I came as an immigrant. My husband is an immigrant. My kids were born here. And the only way we were able to raise our kids was based on a vague recollection on how we were raised as parents. So it's not even how my sibling were raising their kids, because I think lots of things that would have not been allowed in my family of origin are now allowed here, like, phones on the table and stuff like that. But, as an immigrant, what is your reference point? Is, what your parents did successfully. And so there is that, and I think that's partly of, in the paper, we don't have a lot of evidence of what is the mechanism, but we have a couple which are very, very interesting, which are the fact that the parents really work, seem to be working very hard to get these kids a really good education. And these are public schools, they're not fancy public schools. They're actually public school where, a good chunk of the kids get free lunch don't think about, a fancy suburban high school in a affluent area. But, for example, there is a possibility of getting into the gifted program. And so the parents, they learn very quickly what the possibilities are in order to get their kids doing something better, and they tend to push. And, we know that they, from other studies, that they tend to tell kids that they have to work harder and, get better grades. And, maybe they have higher expectations. And, this comes with stress as well, of course, as you can guess. But, the kids in these groups, they tend to spend more hours doing homework. So it's like, there is a part of this. And so the question is, this is a transmission by example.
Yeah.
It could be just simply, I see my parents working very hard. I owe to them. Or it could be some kind of authoritarian model in which the parents say, you're not going to go out with your friend till you finish your homework. Like, we don't know for sure which one of the two, and probably a combination of the two. But that's sort of with the second generation, it starts fading, this effect. And, if you have kids in high school, you know that the peers are more important than the parents. And so you could see that over time, this goes away. And, that's probably, not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, the school selection they talk about here a little bit is also important. So I went to graduate school at Northwestern for engineering, and my daughter went there undergraduate. And she had her heart set on Northwestern. And so, so there is a transmission of ideas or possibilities, and then you follow up on that. So I want to go into another paper.
Yeah.
Diversity in schools, immigrants, and the educational performance of US-born students. This is a very interesting topic. So from a policy perspective, we are in the midst of a major debate here. So you say here we study the effect of exposure to immigrants on the educational outcomes of the US-born students using a unique data set combining population-level birth and school records from Florida. This research question is complicated by substantial school selection of US-born students, especially among white and comparatively affluent students, in response to the presence of immigrant students in the school. We proposed a new identification strategy comparing sibling outcomes with inclusion of family fixed effects to partial out the unobserved non-random effects. So tell me a little bit about the data that you're using here from Florida.
Okay, so the data, the origin of the data is very similar, but this time we actually studied a US-born student. So our question was the following: it's like, okay, this is a very relevant topic, as you say. So these US-born students, they find themselves surrounded by lots of immigrants, in some places more than others. Does this matter for them? And does it matter depending on how well the immigrants perform? And, this is a really hard question to answer for the following reason. First of all, the immigrants go to selective school. So suppose that the immigrants, for example, they care a lot about immigration, education. They end up, they really search for the best school. And so they end up in a very good school where, we know that a good school in the US also means higher income. And so the kids in those schools, they do better than in general, but not because they are affected by the immigrants, but because they come from a more affluent background. So the immigrants select.
Sort of an initial condition effect, sort of.
Right, and also there is this phenomenon called white flight, which is especially the white students tend to select out of certain areas. So what if you do this without the proper identification, what we call in jargon in economics, what happened is that you may end up seeing that the white students go to places where there are fewer immigrants because maybe, or where there are immigrants of a certain type because they have, and then the effect that you see is driven by the fact that they, for example, there are fewer immigrants, so you see, the white students that stay with the immigrants are underperforming, mostly because they're the ones that have limited means and they cannot move. Okay,
it's the selection effect. Yeah.
So how do we approach this? We look at the sibling. So because what we find out in this data is that when, as a parents, you decide to send your kids to a school, unless you move residency for job-related issues, you tend to make the same decision for your second and third child.
Yeah.
And so, but what is entirely possible and happens in the data is that as the kids, the various kids go through the educational system, some of them are surrounded by more immigrants just because there is an immigrant inflow in that school. And because we notice in the paper, it's complicated to describe now in few words, but that parents really don't move at that point. So what we exploit this sibling to sibling, and we say, okay, what's the difference in the academic outcome of a US-born kid compared to his or his brother or his sister when the brother or the sister is getting more exposure to immigrants. And we want to know whether, this is a very important question, because of course, as you see a lot of immigrants coming to school, some of the question have been, these immigrants are going to drain a lot of resources. They're going to make the educational system for our kids less effective. We do find totally the opposite. So we do find zero effect or very limited effect for the affluent white students. They really are unaffected, even when the immigrants are performing less than them, and even when the immigrants are way poorer than them. And then we find a pretty sizable positive effect for the kids, for the US-born kids who are actually coming from a non-affluent background. So these are kids that receive a free lunch, or minority students. And there, the effect is sizable. So having been exposed to immigrants really increases the performance of these students significantly. Is almost like giving their mother, this is one of the extra year of education. And so the way you want to think about this result, and part of this is also driven or is correlated at least with discipline in school. So in those places where there are more immigrants, there are less disciplinary incidents. So one hypothesis that we make, we can definitely check it, is that because there are less disciplinary incidents, it's easier to teach. Maybe the teacher is able to get more out of the class. And certainly this exposure, has a positive effect. And, for those who have been in classroom where it's, there is a lot of disciplinary problems, it's very, very hard to teach. This is actually a mirror to what immigrants do, because, we know that immigrants tend to obey the law more. They tend to be more compliant, maybe because they are more scared of, and so that's the same is happening in school. We found this in this paper, we found it in the other paper. They tend to comply with the rules of the game much more, these kids. And so maybe this is one of the spillovers. The other one could be transmission. Now this is horizontal transmission. So rather than parents transmitting to kids, it could be the kids transmitting to kids. We don't have a very good way of tackling the mechanism, because we don't observe the interaction, we just observe the outcomes.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking, Paula, I don't know if it is possible from a policy perspective. There is sort of a design question here. So when I design a class as an educator, you have better insights into it. If all your data is correct, then I have an optimization problem. So suppose I have three classes, three different groups of people. I want to put together. I could optimize those groups to get the best possible aggregate outcome from those groups by mixing and matching, so to speak, kids in there. I don't know if it's legal. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm just posing the question. Yeah.
I don't think it's legal. No, I think there is a Supreme Court rule that you cannot, for sure, you cannot do it on the basis of race. I don't know if you can do it on the basis of country of origin, but yeah, there is a interesting policy point here, which is that mixing kids and especially exposing US-born students from a less affluent background and minority status to immigrants, and especially high-performing immigrants, will have a positive effect. Experiments of this type in education are really, really hard to do because parents will have all sorts of opinion. And you can even have the immigrants say, wait a moment, you're using us. And so I don't know if this can be done. But, what the paper does, however, is it gives a very reassuring point, especially to the affluent parents who tend to flee, because we find this in the data, the school where there are lots of immigrants, that actually they shouldn't fear these at all because their kids are going to be fine. And so that's an interesting aspect. And the other thing which comes from all these is that there is this view that the immigrants don't learn English. In fact, these kids, they're so sponges, and they learn. So that this is one important thing that we expected, especially on the first paper, that the language barrier were an issue, and instead these kids get off the English as a second language very, very quickly. Of course, they learn very well, and eventually at the end of their on average, the immigrants at the end of their 10th grade, they overperform the non-immigrants, and which is another interesting fact. So that's one aspect. And the second one, which I think is really big picture, is when we think about the contribution of immigrants to the United States, we tend to focus on the workers. Very few people that studied immigrant students, especially these young. But there is an interesting fact, which is that the immigrant children, the children of the immigrants, are actually right now pretty much the only category that is doing better than their parents on average in the US. And I think that goes back to this long-term orientation, this willingness to prove yourself, especially coming from a poorer countries for a more poor country and so on. And so the question of the contribution of immigrants is not just what the workers do, but also what type of children do they raise in this country, and what are the what would those children bring to society in general.
Yeah, I mean, so that goes into the transmission question. It also goes into the attribute question. I think somewhere in the paper, this paper, that paper, you talk about hard work. And the general notion is that immigrants are very hardworking, and that's why they're successful. But if I understand your paper correctly, there isn't enough evidence that hard work has a positive effect on success. That's sort of counterintuitive for me. I always told my daughter, work hard and then things will work out. But you're finding no evidence for hard work to really correlate it with success.
No, actually, in the second paper, when we look at so the LTO, the long-term orientation, is actually also a measure of how much you teach hard work.
Okay.
And the sacrification of the present for the future is very much like in the line of hard work. So certainly for the immigrants, that's a dimension. In the paper in which we try to look at the mechanism through which immigrants affect US-born kids, we actually investigate whether the long-term orientation of the immigrants they are exposed to is really driving some of the results. So what we do, we divide the immigrant exposure into two groups. Those with a high long-term orientation above the US, because actually the US has a long-term orientation which is in the bottom quartile. So that's one of the issues here, is that we're doing this in the US where, this is not it's a very impatient culture.
It's not a very good comparison,
Right. And so we take the immigrants that come from a culture that has a higher long-term orientation of the US and we divided that. And what we find is that controlling for the performance, for school performance of the immigrants, the main effect is actually driven by high LTO immigrants. So the immigrants that have long-term orientation are the ones that drive a better performance of the US-born. So we find both at the level of the immigrants, coming from a culture of long-term orientation, which also means hard work. We don't see actually how much they work. We saw the culture where they come from, so we can only assume that this is one of the driver. And then, that this really leads to really good academic results. And as you said, with the limitation what academic results means, but certainly, so they work harder, they get higher results. Probably they're going to get into better colleges. They tend to graduate more and so forth. And then for the US born, being exposed to the group of immigrants with high work ethic and long-term orientation, this is where the benefit comes the most. So there is a validation of this, teaching your kids work hard, you're going to be compensated.
Yeah, so one thing you said, if I understand this correctly, the high LTO culture, and if I remember correctly, South Korea is one of them, high LTO culture, will have a much higher influence on the performance, so given the hypothesis that an immigrant could have positive effect on a cohort of students, not all of them, but some of them, let's say, the higher the LTO culture is, the higher our expectation of that influence, right?
Yeah, so if I compare say one student is exposed to the same fraction of immigrants, but coming from a high LTO culture versus another one who is exposed, an identical fraction, but coming from a lower LTO, the effect is all coming from the high LTO culture. So in some way, like, you can imagine the vignette in which these students coming from these immigrant students coming from high LTO culture, they work very hard, they lead by example, they get fewer disciplinary incidents, the class is working smoothly, and so the US-born students exposed to them, they tend to perform better over time.
Of the 200 countries that we have, the LTO culture then is a bit like a deficit problem, a capital account deficit or a current account deficit. I don't know where it stays, but it would be interesting to normalize the LTO deficit. So, in some sense, as you say, South Korea potentially have a very high surplus in LTO. US, we know, has a very, very high deficit in LTO. So immigration could be sort of a trade policy issue too in this context, could it?
Yeah, so I think this could be probably controversial, but it's sort of telling you that maybe some culture, and the question is, this is more of a political question than an economic question, which is, there are differences in culture among immigrants and also differences with respect to the US. Is there any way in which we think about the value of this culture differentially, and to what extent we want one type of culture versus the other? This also speaks to the question of assimilation, right? For years, we mention about assimilation, but assimilation on this dimension specifically means that we're going to converge to a lower long-term orientation, which means maybe less effort. And is it what we want to do? Like, just the parents are often, I talk to a lot of parents that are always horrified by the fact that by the time their kids go to high school, these are immigrant parents, they don't listen to them anymore, and they just listen to the peers. And that is real assimilation. But the parents are really worried that they're going to lose the resilience and the hard work that they thought that they were trying to instill in them, right? And it's a quite interesting exercise. But on the other hand, you hear, and I heard this recently, and I thought it was very puzzling. I was saying, it's a bit unfair that this is at the level of the graduate students, but the graduate students work very, very hard in this country. That's unfair.
That's because of the professors. They put them to work,
No, but the question is the graduate students that come from certain culture, maybe IIT, because they were so used to work so hard, they keep on working hard. And, do we really want them in the classroom rather than, when, especially if everything is graded on a curve, right? And so it's like, I think that's an interesting issue for the concept of the melting pot and, what's optimal also for U.S. policy in general, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I know that I have to let you go, Paola. So it's really interesting topics. It has a lot of implications for education, for policy, for immigration. And I know that you do some work in organizational structure and organizational culture as well. So there's a lot of implications. I don't think we have enough research. I don't think we have enough focus on these topics, right? And so, yeah, thanks for sending the papers and coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Jill. This was really a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.